everyone. Welcome to episode 8 of Terpenes and Testing, the podcast. This broadcast is brought to you by Mace Media Group and Terpenes and Testing magazine, the industry's first publication dedicated to cannabis science. I'm Jason Lupoi, and I'm the editor-in-chief of Terpenes and Testing magazine, and I'll be your host as we navigate across the landscape of cannabis and psychedelic science. Despite cannabis being tragically branded as a Schedule I drug for now and for decades, there are medical doctors who have put their reputations on the line to voice their opinions on the value of cannabis medicine. We discussed this with Dr. Brian Donner in our inaugural episode of this show, and Dr. Donner indicated that he was ostracized by some in the medical community when he first became outspoken about cannabis. Although this is surely evolving for the better, the endocannabinoid system is still not something that has been routinely taught to healthcare professionals, despite its involvement in a wide array of physiological processes, including fertility, pregnancy, the immune system, appetite, mood, and memory. So for this episode, I wanted to speak with Dr. Ethan Russo, who popularized the concept of the entourage effect in his pivotal paper entitled Taming THC. Dr. Russo has published a wealth of information on cannabis in general, including a historical account of cannabis all the way back to the Sumerians, who apparently had a word for hemp or cannabis. And he's also published a paper on clinical endocannabinoid system deficiencies. Dr. Russo is a board-certified neurologist, psychopharmacology researcher, and author. He is the founder and CEO of credoscience.com. Previously, he was Director of Research and Development of the International Cannabis and Cannabinoids Institute, the Medical Director of Phytex, a biotechnology company researching and developing innovative approaches targeting the human endocannabinoid system. And from 2003 to 2014, he served as Senior Medical Advisor, Medical Monitor, and Study Physician to GW Pharmaceuticals for numerous Phase 1 through Phase 3 clinical trials of Sativex for alleviation of cancer pain unresponsive to optimized opioid treatment, and initial studies of Epidiolex for intractable epilepsy. Dr. Russo, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So it's always great to talk with you, and I really wanted to dive right in and start talking about our endocannabinoid system. And so we have cannabinoid receptors that interact with endocannabinoids that our bodies produce. And I was wondering if you could explain for us what happens when the production of these molecules is out of sorts.
Well, there can be a variety of things. Like in any system, there can be an excess of activity. That's something we see associated with the metabolic syndrome in people with severe obesity. But more commonly, we have deficiencies of the endocannabinoid system, which are going to manifest in a number of ways, but notably by producing pain, but also subject to creating problems in a variety of systems, such as digestion. So when I proposed the theory of clinical endocannabinoid deficiency, we focused on 3 disorders, which were migraine, fibromyalgia, and irritable bowel syndrome. What they have in common is that these are disorders that are diagnosed clinically, meaning that there are no specific diagnostic tests for them. They're all characterized by pain where there's no obvious tissue damage to be seen. And they all express a sort of hyperreactivity to pain. So there's pain with stimuli that ordinarily wouldn't be painful. And the most common expression of that is the sensitivity to light and sound that is one of the manifestations of migraine.
Do you think it's fair to say that our bodies are almost mechanized to be able to utilize cannabis, that if there's an internal deficiency in endocannabinoid production, that the best way that we found so far to supplement that is through the ingestion of phytocannabinoids?
Well, that is one way. I think it's probably preferable to address lifestyle factors first, where those are deficient and could be improved. But it certainly is the case that the quickest way to deal with an endocannabinoid deficiency is probably supplementation with phytocannabinoids, meaning most commonly from cannabis. It also is an explanation of why we find cannabis is helpful in so many disparate disorders. And it is because the endocannabinoid system is the major homeostatic regulator of physiology. It's sort of got its hand in every process by which our bodies work. So it should be no great surprise that when things are awry, there often is a role for cannabinoids therapeutically.
You mentioned that the endocannabinoid system is so pervasive throughout a myriad of physiological processes, and I'm wondering, and I know we talked about this before, but I'm wondering what your thoughts are regarding why this is still not a part of medical training, and I'm curious as to how if doctors don't know about this effect that deficiencies in the endocannabinoid system have, and if they're kind of willingly turning a blind eye to something so important to our well-being, how can they effectively treat us?
Well, that's a great question. Unfortunately, the endocannabinoid system, let alone cannabis, is rarely, if ever, taught in medical school. You would think that something that's so basic to physiology would be required reading. Particularly, let me give you one example. There are more CB1 cannabinoid receptors in the brain than there are for all of the neurotransmitters combined. So it might make sense that it's important, and it quite frankly is. But this is a conversation I've had many times. I went to medical school in the 70s. That was a long time ago. The curriculum was pretty intense then. And we've had several decades of advancement that have to be crammed in. So the complaint we often hear from medical educators is, where are we going to fit this in? What are we going to drop so that we can incorporate this into the curriculum? So it's, I think, the misguided idea that you've got to get rid of something else to make room for this when it's so fundamental to begin with.
Yeah, I would think that, given that fundamental nature, something so important to our bodies, and as we've continued to learn new things about the endocannabinoid system, I would think that it would definitely be of high importance to make sure people are trained well on it.
Certainly.
So you mentioned to me in an interview a few years back that you kind of got started in being interested in cannabis and ethnobotanical plants, and you traveled to South America in the early 90s to study those kinds of plants for medicinal purposes. And I was curious if you could talk about what plants you studied and what was the outcome of that journey of your life.
Sure. So this does go back to the early 90s. I decided in my practice that I wasn't making the kind of advances that we'd want to see with conventional pharmacotherapy. And so I thought that it might be time to return to the idea of botanical medicine. I was most interested in migraine. And so I tried to find out where in the world were there the most traditional medicines used to treat headaches. And like so many things, it turned out to be Amazonia. So I took Spanish classes at night and eventually made 2 trips to the Amazon, a shorter one in 1994, and then a longer one for a couple of months working with the Machigenga tribe in Parque Nacional del Manu in eastern Peru. So I was interested specifically in 2 things, treatments for migraine, but also psychedelic plants or hallucinogens. Now, the interesting thing, and I knew this before I went, was throughout history, there's been this thread that plants or drugs that are hallucinogenic at high doses often are used to treat migraine at much, much lower doses. And that proved true amazingly so with the Machigenga. They had numerous plants that they used to treat headaches. I saw these being used. I used them myself. They were uniquely effective. And what many of them have in common is an ingredient called DMT, dimethyltryptamine. So dimethyltryptamine is actually an endogenous component in humans in tiny amounts, but it also is a Schedule 1 drug, a hallucinogen at higher doses. But there are many plants in Amazonia and actually elsewhere in the world that contain small amounts of DMT and often are used traditionally to combat headaches. And also explored the numerous psychedelic plants that the Machigenga used and hundreds of others. On the course of about 2.5 months, my research partner, Glenn Shepard, and I collected some 500 plants in the pharmacopoeia of the Machigenga, and that was just the beginning. It wasn't everything they used. So, I mean, it just is a very vivid demonstration of people adapting to a hostile environment. And basically, the rainforest is their medicine chest.
Wow, that's really impressive that they would have that many plants in their own sort of library of medicinal possibilities.
Absolutely.
So, what are your thoughts on the current trajectory of psychedelics as a viable medicinal option for things like depression, anxiety, PTSD?
Well, it's extremely promising. You know, it's sort of a rehashed story. It's quite analogous to what happened with the prohibition of cannabis. Cannabis has been used traditionally for thousands of years, and it was rendered prohibited in 1937 in this country. There was also quite a bit of work done clinically with LSD and psilocybin in the 50s and early 60s before they were made illegal. And as with cannabis, we're seeing a resurgence now of clinical research with the psychedelics. But I have seen this myself already among various people. And I can tell you that among the Machigenga, there's a traditional usage of ayahuasca, what they call kamarampi in the Machigenga tribe. But that is the vine of the soul, Banisteriopsis caapi, combined with psychotria, that's a DMT providing plant. They use this for divination to solve problems. Where do we hunt? Where is the plant that will help my wife with her pain? All of these kinds of things. It's part of their cosmology, and again, adaptation to life in a hostile environment. You stick the average Westerner in an environment like that, they're not going to last very long.
Right.
A lot of challenges in the jungle.
So, in your experience, have you seen these plants to be as effective as quickly as what some of the literature is saying now, where somebody takes one dose of psilocybin or DMT or some other type of psychedelics, like ibogaine maybe, and people are no longer feeling addicted to opioids, or they don't feel the symptoms of depression, things like that?
Sure. Again, this is no surprise to me because the traditional usage of these plants supports the same kinds of observations, specifically the use of ayahuasca to treat alcoholism, or peyote to treat alcoholism. These are matters that were well documented in the past, and unfortunately, it's taken all this time for us to rediscover them, if you will.
Right, right. It's to me, it's pretty sad that there was that body of literature starting to come out, and then for several decades now, it's just been cast aside as a taboo, or something that had no part of medicine, such that it was they were scheduled in the Schedule 1 category.
Sure. Well, I'm here to tell you that there are hundreds of drugs in the pharmacopoeia now that are much more dangerous than cannabis or the psychedelics. Absolutely the case.
Well, there's a big interest now. It's surprising to me that I was just talking with somebody the other day, and we were talking about how in 2019 basically a lot of people started growing hemp legally. We were never allowed to, or not never, but there was a long period of time at least that hemp could not be cultivated in the United States. And just 3 short years later, it seems like CBD has come and gone. And it's been in so many different products. I think that that's kind of diluted the medicinal capacity that the molecule actually has. Now you hear of all these synthetic or semi-synthetic cannabinoids on the market, and the surprising thing to me is there's actually cannabinoids that I hadn't heard about that I saw one place started selling. I had never heard of these versions of the cannabinoids. I was wondering what your thoughts are on some of these products like THCO acetate or THCP or HHC products being sold as hemp derived.
Sure. Let's go one by one. THCO acetate is a semi-synthetic, or could be made totally synthetically. However, the process is extremely dangerous using flammable or explosive solvents. I wouldn't trust it. Plus, THC acetate and many of these others are what are known as full agonists at the CB1 receptor. And that's too much. Both THC and anandamide, the endogenous cannabinoid, are what are called weak partial agonists. The endocannabinoid system is one that needs a gentle nudge when it's deficient, not a hard push like you get from a full agonist. Additionally, many of these preparations like THCO acetate are going to invariably have solvent contamination that can't be totally purged. And the drugs themselves, again, are just too powerful and are prone to producing side effects. THCP is tetrahydrocannabidiol. This was an agent that was predicted a long time ago. So it's got a 7-carbon side chain instead of 5 as compared to THC. The longer side chain tends to equate to higher potency. And THCP, which was discovered by an Italian group in hemp in tiny amounts, is estimated to be 23 times more potent than THC. Again, that sounds impressive, but I think it's probably too much. And I, as you, have seen online ads now for material containing THCP, and I just could not recommend it. It's hard to imagine how that's going to be harnessed therapeutically, and certainly the potential for people having a toxic psychosis or panic attack when they use this kind of product is going to be very high.
So that if somebody was having that kind of reaction, that toxic psychosis to just plain old Delta 9 THC, something like THCP could really be detrimental to them.
Yeah, I think so. Now, I would hasten to add that I don't think making them illegal is going to be helpful, because prohibition hasn't worked before for anything else. The real solution is to legalize cannabis and obviate the need or the attraction for some of these other agents. A lot of people end up using semi-synthetics or totally synthetic cannabinoids as a dodge against urine drug testing, because normally those kinds of agents aren't picked up on a urine drug screen unless somebody's specifically looking for them. So again, if things were done properly, in my opinion, with legal and regulated cannabis, we'll probably see a lot less commerce in these synthetic alternatives that are much more dangerous.
Yeah, absolutely. I just saw this morning a store advertising Delta 8 THC products here in Pittsburgh, and it's been, pretty well flaunted. And I could see those kinds of standard urinalysis tests changing or migrating with the times, I guess. With some of these other products. I know from what I've heard, Pennsylvania is looking to ban Delta 8 products, and there's been a lot of concern on Delta 8. And I've heard, a lot of people say that the molecule itself isn't what's dangerous, it's the ways that people are going about creating these types of products.
Sure, that's true in this instance. Delta 8 is a natural component of cannabis in small amounts. However, nobody's found a chemovar of cannabis that produces large amounts that would make it extraction worthy. Rather, what they're doing is they're using the glut of CBD around from hemp products to transmogrify it into Delta 8 THC. But in the process, it's invariably associated with Delta 6, Delta 10. We know even less about those. Maybe they're okay, but that again really isn't the problem. It is residual toxicity that could accrue from the chemistry involved, residual solvents and what have you. Plus, I have no confidence whatsoever in the quality control activities of the people that make these things. So God knows whether the dosage that's on the label is true or not, and what else might be in it. I think it's pharmacological Russian roulette.
Yeah, I think Chris Hudala at Proverde Labs had said that he measured something like 6,000 plus Delta 8 products, and not one of them was what he would describe as clean. They were all pretty contaminated with other things, unknowns, some of the isomers you just mentioned, and Orange Photonics. They recently wrote an article regarding their evaluation of some of these other products like THCO acetate or hexahydrocannabinol, and they were finding that many of the products had the precursors to those molecules, but not the molecules as on the label, or they just didn't have any of those molecules at all.
Yes, but again, in a legal market that's regulated, none of this should happen.
So I guess for my last question here, I'm curious, when you look out to the future of the industry, given all you know and everywhere that you've been, everywhere you've traveled to, what do you see for both the cannabis industry and for this burgeoning psychedelics industry?
Well, unfortunately, it all depends on political action. And I've got to say, unless something changes radically this year, the prospects for further progress on cannabis legalization are not very good at all. I'm old enough to remember how things were close to decriminalization back in the 70s. That got derailed due to a combination of factors. And right after that, we had Ronald Reagan come in, and it was again the dark ages of prohibition. Things got considerably worse. Anybody that thinks it can't happen again, it can happen again. A lot of people say that it's too late to put the genie back in the bottle, but we are still light years from where we should be on cannabis policy. Now, In relation to psychedelics, I think that the pathway is a little rosier. However, I'm going to editorialize here to say that I think a lot of the activity has been misguided in that it is employing synthetic single molecules rather than leveraging the wisdom of the plants themselves. I'd like to see more botanical psychedelics in the pipeline for clinical development because just as with cannabis, I believe that there is potential synergy in these other components that may render them safer and better for these various therapeutic endeavors.
That's a great choice of words, the wisdom of the plants. Dr. Russo, I want to thank you kindly for joining us today and for sharing your expertise with us. We're always hungry for cannabis science, and it's remarkable and fortunate that the industry has someone like you to champion for cannabis and psychedelics medicine. So again, thank you.
My pleasure.
And thank all of you listeners for tuning in. We'll see you next time on Terpenes and Testing, the podcast. Until then, please come visit us at www.terpenesandtesting.com or on one of our social media platforms. Cheers.